So how was it that our Marie, Dickie Mountbatten's great-aunt, a relatively obscure German princess with some paternity issues, managed to score an engagement to the most eligible bachelor in Europe, which would set up her family for a glittering, if increasingly dangerous, future? And what happened when she and her brother got to the biggest, grandest court in the world? In 1838, the Russian Tsarist Empire was doing really well. It had rebounded from the early Napoleonic defeats and 1812 invasion with victory and territorial expansion, always an amazing palate cleanser, and the Russian autocracy was strong enough to first cause and then fight off an early crack at a revolution in 1825. In Europe, Russia had territorial back. It had hung on to most of Poland, despite Poland's strenuous efforts to get free again, and it held securely Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. And Tsar Nicholas I was keeping up with his repression at home, too. Nicholas I was a pretty rough autocrat who was actively against education, any form of innovation, pro-widespread censorship, and the repression of any non-Russian culture. He has unfortunately just been getting better looking with time. The following 2 centuries of Russian history have made the tyranny of Nicholas I look increasingly vanilla. Nicholas's oldest son was called Alexander, and he and the Prince of Hesse-Darmstadt had both been named for Alexander I. He had been Nicholas's oldest brother, who had lost quite a lot to Napoleon before becoming the ruler that reversed Emperor Bonaparte's trajectory in 1812. Alexander had been married to Wilhelmine's sister, and by this time there were lots of young Alexanders about in the royal houses of Europe, particularly if you had any Russian connections. The Tsarevich Alexander was informally called Sasha, so I'll use that for him quite a lot. When Sasha grew up, he was a bit independent-minded, empathetic, and clever. He had this tendency, when taken on tours of the Russian countryside, to insist that they stop in some of the rough-looking villages they were just supposed to be travelling through. To the consternation of his retinues, he kept finding ways to meet actual people and see the actual conditions and circumstances that they lived under. That included people who were prisoners. And that's really good going for an early 19th century Tsarevich. He was personally retiring and self-contained, which in this age of the worship of strong autocracy made many consider him to be a weaker, paler successor to his father. He was a bit of a harlot, and had already had a few mistresses by the time he was 18, but by then he was ready for marriage, and everyone wanted him to get on with ensuring the succession. Russia didn't really need anyone that engagement cycle, and taking into account your kid's feelings when you could was becoming quite the thing. So he was sent on a grand tour that was also a bride scouting trip. Russia had maintained its interest in keeping a nice, soft western front made of all those German territories like a pillow on its hip, so that tour would have a lot of stops in Germany. He was sent with his tutor, the poet Zhukovsky, and a suitable retinue. Sasha ended up spending a lot of time in luxurious beds in spa towns in Germany and in Italy with a really bad lung infection, which became bronchitis, that took so long to clear up it might well have been pneumonia, but no one wanted to say it. His father somewhat demanded he get going again in January of 1839, not quite regardless of his condition, but close. Once the Tsarevich was back on his feet and managing to genteelly party, they went to Baden, where Alexander had a much-anticipated stop to meet Princess Alexandrine of Baden, who his father had rather been pointing him at, perhaps trying to create some kind of set. That failed due to an apparent mutual lack of interest of the Alexanderish parties involved. Alexandrine remained on the back foot, and Alexander was one of those sensitive royal souls who apparently needed more chemistry than indifference in order to marry and procreate some children for his country and the future of his house. Alexander generally wasn't impressed with a lot of the royal women that he met. He got along well with just two. He had a good time with the pre-Albert Queen Victoria in early summer 1839. She was particularly pleased with his dancing abilities. But there were three good reasons that they were never going to marry. First, she was the monarch of an empire and he was going to be. It would be politically terrifying for the whole of Europe if they married. Second, Victoria would fall for her Albert heavily later that year. And third, while he was a liberal appreciator of women, according to letters of the time, Sasha was pretty sure he'd already met the girl he was going to marry, and he was arranging to go back and see her again after the British visit. Because a brief and unscheduled stop in Darmstadt in March 1839, suggested by General Cavellin just so that everyone could rest on their way to somewhere more important, had unexpectedly turned the trip into a success when it introduced them to the, oh God no, 14-year-old Princess Marie. And he was 20, and he was very worryingly for our days smitten during an evening at the theatre. Not least because Marie had those ethereal kind of good looks, and was being poorly treated, and that kind of beauty and the opportunity to be a romantic rescuer and extreme youth were catnip to Sasha. They were all traits that would show up in his second wife as well as his first. A long engagement with Marie was thankfully agreed, and it was because the bride was considered too young to marry. It would be nowhere near long enough for us. Sasha returned to Darmstadt after the visit to Britain to confirm his intentions towards Marie. Then he came back a year later in 1840 for the official proposal. When Marie hit 16, his parents travelled to Darmstadt to pick her up for her assimilation period. They would wait a total of just over 2 years for Marie to apparently grow up enough and assimilate a bit, and Marie would be roughly 16 and a half when they married, the day before Sasha turned 23 on the 28th of April 1841, by which time she had spent 6 months in Russia learning the language and converting her faith. Now, there is another version of Marie and Sasha's meeting, and it's been repeated in a lot of history books. If you've read that they met when Marie was 15 a year later in 1840, well, that version is partly based in Hessian sources, and partly in total wishful thinking, and partly in Dickie Mountbattens' 20th century falsehoods.
Dickie Mountbattens' 20th century falsehoods!
Yeah, I need to work on my harmonising, and this is going to be a regular segment. Dickie was vigorously thumbing the scales of history most of the time that he was on the planet. The contemporary evidence, like Sasha's letters about Marie, the recorded controversy about a paternity, his grand tour, all happens in 1839. So that's a problem. The mover and arranger for the engagement in this version is supposed to have been Wilhelmine's sister, Dowager Tsarina Elizabeth, Sasha and Marie's aunt, and Alexander Prime's widow. And the twist Dickie put on it,
Dickie Mountbattens' 20th century falsehoods,
was to confidently assure his parents' biographer that the Tsarina Elizabeth began the process by mentioning the match to Ludwig when she visited for Wilhelmine's funeral. Except she'd been dead for a decade by then. The Dowager Tsarina Elizabeth died back in 1826. Her days of visiting funerals and arranging marriages, and dare I say her influence at court, were a decade in the mausoleum. There's no way around either uncomfortable truth, I'm afraid. Alexander decided he fancied Marie the first time they met when she was just 14, and Darmstadt's Russian connection did not make it important enough to be on the original itinerary. And which one of these is more problematic has swapped over with time. Both Alexanders got along really well with their prospective new brother-in-law, and when Sasha came back in 1840 for the official proposal, a meet-cute was arranged for the boys, where brother Alexander presented Sasha with a painting that he'd made of Marie. And Alexander was formally invited to go with his sister to Russia. She was going to need support, and he had military ambitions and 2 nephews as well as his brothers ahead of him in the succession now, so he had every reason to go. Before Marie hit 16 and the Tsar and Tsarina went to pick her up, the last serious attempt to bring up her paternity issues came from Count Orlov. Count Orlov was an anti-German influence guy in the Russian court, and he was also one of Nicholas's oldest friends. And he brought up the questions about Marie's paternity during a private conversation with the Tsar one evening. And Tsar Nicholas said, "Goodness me, who are you? And who am I? And who on earth can ever prove such a thing? And I should not advise anyone to suggest that the heir to the Russian throne is marrying a bastard." And do you know, the debate over Marie's paternity in Russia cooled right the hell down. For Nicholas's lifetime, it was not something you mentioned if you also wanted a future. He swiped the paternity issue right off the table, helped along by the fact that, well, for Russia, the really important bloodline was the one she was going to be carrying. Although this could all have changed if Marie did not do well, or perhaps cause trouble in her new role. There was still some resistance to Sasha's choice of Marie, bit of snobbishness about the status of Hesse-Darmstadt from the court and his Prussian mother. But all the serious remaining concerns were related to her health and fertility. If you're talking about a royal woman in this period, you might as well just say them together. Health and fertility. She'd been described as delicate and pale, which was coded talk in those days for consumption. They were worried that she had TB like her mother. And they would turn out to be right. Marie did have tuberculosis at just 16. And it would deeply affect her life expectancy, and her marriage. But it didn't affect her fertility. So thank God for that. Marie, despite being incredibly young and quite freaked out by her change in circumstance, absolutely smashed it. For a dynastic consort, she didn't seem to put a foot wrong, and the first 10 to 15 years of her marriage, before her health really started bringing her down, were her golden period. The girl who'd been kept out of the capital of her small country was suddenly a feature of national events with a cast of tens of thousands living in the most incredible palaces. These vast Baroque fever dream statement pieces contained a huge and rambunctious court, and some of the best small towns in Russia were built on their outskirts just to accommodate the servants. It was a whole new weird world for Marie, but she coped. She learned Russian diligently, quickly, and well. Used to be more optional for a consort, but by Marie's time it really wasn't anymore. She converted to the Orthodox religion with enthusiasm, delighting the church authorities, and her shyness meant she stayed out of the court infighting. That was a big tick for Tsar Nicholas. He'd grown up with Wilhelmine's sister Elizabeth as consort, and when she'd been neglected by her husband, she had taken lovers and formed a splinter court. And Marie was clearly not going to be that kind of trouble. But this reticence meant that the court saw her as standoffish, and the court certainly thought that that was a problem. Her new husband was devoted to her. Like his father, he had a lot of affairs, but it's fair to say he didn't fall in love with anyone else for 20 years. Sasha and Marie were both liberal, committed and smart, and they became a working political partnership for liberal Russian causes like freedom for the serfs, which many Tsars had now wanted to do at some point and promised to do at some point but utterly failed to do. Their salon was perhaps the only safe place in Russia to talk about such things. And while staying well out of Nicholas's political way, they slowly gained support and built consensus around their causes, and leading court liberals quietly prepared for the coming reign. But the main test for Marie as a dynastic consort was still ahead. It depended on biological luck and some plain luck. The question that would write her future was, how would she breed? And the answer was with quality, quantity, and a heavy preference for males. 8 children, 6 sons, a whole bench of subs for the Romanov team. And all of that shot Marie to near hallowed status with her father-in-law inside the first 5 years. And therefore the court could lump its dissatisfaction at her quietness and shut the hell up itself for a bit. And what of Marie's brother, Alexander, Dicky Mountbatten's grandfather, of whom the dominant narrative has always been that he went to Russia and had this wonderful, flawless, youthful military career, and then had to give it all up for love, as he had lost his heart to a simple lady-in-waiting. Well, that narrative takes a really long walk around his early career catastrophes and the 6 months pregnant woman in the room. But what the granddad of House Mountbatten did in his youth, which apparently at one point included a few actresses, will have to wait for next time. I wish to thank members of the most noble and ancient order of the Vibrant Waistcoat, whose usernames you can see now and who will continue to appear at the end of each episode. Membership of this order is now closed in order to keep it exclusive, at least until I open up a Patreon, and then anyone who pays money will be able to get in, thus encapsulating the full traditions of the honour system. If you would like your username to join another, very slightly lesser order of chivalry that I'll be making up for next episode, just reply to the pinned comment I've got below. Thank you for the views, and the likes, and the subs, and your time.